So hello everyone, we're dealing here today with the Council of Trent. We're basically going to just do a sort of an introduction of why it took so long actually to respond to the Reformation. It took a very, very long time, actually 28 years. The Reformation began, I've done a couple of previous videos just to recap quickly actually. The Reformation began in 1517 when Martin Luther posted 95 Theses, where he actually strongly objected to the whole idea of indulgences, which meant that people were encouraged to give money to the church in order to have indulgences. And he was very largely right about that. In actual fact, a lot of Catholic theologians at the time, and before Luther came along at all, objected to this. They actually thought that it was sort of a shady practice. And however, as Luther continued his conflict with the church over the next couple of years, he didn't just actually look for a change in relation to the practice of the church. He was also beginning to challenge the whole idea of the theology itself of the church. He was beginning to challenge the doctrines of the church in regard to a number of issues, and he done that actually by writing a few books in the year 1520, where he actually, on one book, he actually invited the nobility of Germany to actually get involved in church affairs, which is probably the biggest blunder of his career, given what happened afterwards in England and France and several other countries. But he couldn't have foreseen that at the time. But he actually wrote another book called The Freedom of the Christian, whereby he actually puts a tremendous emphasis on this idea of faith, just faith alone. And he believes that salvation comes through faith alone. There's no need for any of the sacraments, pilgrimages, penance, rosaries, or anything like that. He rejects all that. He develops, in effect, a new theology, a theology based on a foundation stone of faith, simply faith alone and nothing else. And that seems to be a doctrine that he developed strongly in a book called The Freedom of the Christian. And he actually wrote a third book in 1520 as well, called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And here he basically condemns an awful lot of the church practices, especially most of the sacraments and all that type of thing. So by the actual time that Trent comes around in the mid-40s, the church has a long time to actually consider Luther's ideas. So his ideas are basically a tremendous emphasis on faith. He completely condemns a whole range of church practices, especially to do with the sacraments and all that. So the church has to actually try and either compromise or else try and reject Luther completely in terms of his new set of ideas. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. And actually, what they do actually is they take on board many of the actual ideas of reform in the church. For instance, priests are in some cases very badly educated. Some people, sometimes they're nephews of the bishop, and there are various different family connections that are using the actual priesthood as a means of livelihood, but not necessarily dedicated to the faith. Some of them are very poorly educated. So Luther is actually complaining about all these things, and he wants reform of all these things. And a lot of Catholic theologians actually agree with him on a lot of these things. But actually it's in regard to the theology, which is the doctrine of the church, that actually the church itself finds itself mostly in conflict with Luther. And as they study his books and study what he has to say over the 1520s and the 1530s, the church is a long time. But actually, the main reason is not that they're studying, of course, Luther. There's other reasons to do with politics. Like, for instance, the Pope. Rome is sacked in 1527 by the Emperor Charles V, and the Pope is really not sure where he stands in relation to. It's a tricky balancing act to actually try and pacify the actual English king, King Henry VIII, on the one hand, and Charles V, the emperor, on the other hand, who's more powerful because he's over all of the European dynasties and that type of thing. So the Pope is actually unsure as well about certain aspects, certain bishops, exactly where they stand in relation to reform. And of course, the previous experience of the church had been that some of the church councils went very badly. very badly, especially in regard to actually the Pope himself. And for instance, in previous situations a few centuries earlier, there emerged a rival Pope in France, and at one stage there was actually 3 popes in the church. So the church was extremely anxious not to make a bad situation worse. So they were very reluctant, hesitant to actually have a council meeting until they were pretty sure that actually it would actually bring about some form of unity within the church itself. So they had also to consider whether or not they would compromise and try and accommodate some of Luther's ideas and try and reunite the church that way, or whether they'd simply take a very strong position in regard to traditional Catholic teaching. So that was what they had to decide basically. And as they went on, as the actual the Trent situation went on. It went on for 18 years actually. There was 3 major sessions. Started in 1545, didn't end until actually 1563. And during that time, of course, there was tremendous changes all over Europe, especially in places like England. King Henry VIII died in 1547, and over the next few, King Henry VIII was very much a Catholic himself. Like the 39 articles, or the actual 6 articles in 1539, was meant to stabilise the church in England. That was a very pro-Catholic document. It dealt with that on a previous video. It very much, it was pro-transubstantiation, pro the Mass, pro-confession, pro all the major Catholic principles, completely different to Luther actually. So there was a tremendous amount of confusion in Europe throughout this 20-year period, from about the early 20s until the early 40s. And the church was therefore reluctant to actually hold a meeting in the middle of all this chaos. But eventually they did. They held a meeting in 45, and it was actually something, the first session of Trent was only attended by something like 50 or 60 bishops. As it went on for 18 years. There was increasing numbers that came, and eventually by 63 there was up to 200 bishops, which was represented the entire Catholic tradition within the European context at that time. And of course, the logistics of bringing the church together too was very difficult, in the sense that the most modern, fastest form of transport at that time was horses and horse-drawn carriages and that type of thing for the cardinals that came up from Rome. Trent is actually located in the north of Italy. It was only a small town at that time, about 5,000 or 6,000 people. So it was a big event to have a church council held there. The reason it was held there and not in Rome is that they wanted to try and encourage some of the major clergy from the actual German territories to attend the actual council. And it wasn't far to come. It was also kind of a remote location in the Alps. And of course there was also safety concerns. There was a tremendous amount of emotion in regard to religion at this time. The Swiss Civil War was based on different concepts of theology, and Zwingli lost his life. So there was an awareness by bishops as well that it wasn't exactly safe to be travelling into Rome, because there was various different extremists on both sides that could attack and maybe even kill bishops. So as well as that, there was travel situation. The most they could travel at that stage was about 12 to 15 mile, or maybe 20 kilometres in a day. So that meant that it took, in some cases, it took 3-4 weeks to get to Trent, and depending on where you're coming from. If you're coming from the east of, say, Poland or the south of Spain, it could have taken up to 6 weeks to get to Trent. So it was quite a difficult journey as well. So broadly speaking, there was a demand for reform, which an awful lot of people in the church actually, even before Martin Luther, would have actually agreed with, that there was need for reform, because a lot of corruption in terms of the way some bishops had several different dioceses and had revenue streams coming in from them, and some bishops were actually acting like nobles, in the sense that they very seldom were in their diocese. Some of them controlled 2 or 3 dioceses. They had massive amounts of revenue. the whole thing needed to be reformed and changed in order to actually bring about a more efficient church anyway. That was one aspect of the actual Counter-Reformation. It actually looked at that, and it brought about significant changes in that, which I intend to deal with in a video in a week's time. But in terms of doctrine, actually, the church had a different approach to that, because there were several doctrines that Martin Luther had challenged in relation to the Eucharist, for instance. There was different radical reformers who believed that, for instance, Zwingli believed that the Eucharist was only a symbol. Martin Luther himself had a different idea in regard to that, in that he actually believed in the real presence of Christ, but he didn't actually accept the Catholic Church's interpretation of the Eucharist either. So there's a lot of conflict there, and actually the church had to actually deal with this, deal with the idea of reform on the one hand, and deal with doctrine on the other hand. And that's what they set out to do, and it was actually quite a difficult process that went on for 18 years. It started in the year 1545. It didn't end until 63. So in that 18-year period, there was a lot of upheaval in Europe as well. For instance, England changed basically from being a Catholic country at the end of Henry VIII's reign in 47, which his son came in for 6 years between 47 and 53, and that changed things in England quite a bit. And during that time, the Council of Trent was sitting on an intermittent basis. It was 3 major sessions over an 18-year period, and this actual Council of Trent is regarded as one of the most significant councils in the history of the Church. We'll be dealing with its teachings actually next week. If you'd like to subscribe, what actually Trent taught in terms of Catholic doctrine. And the reason this is so significant is that the actual principles that Trent laid down in the middle of the actual 16th century last to this day, in the sense that this was a clarification of what the actual church teaches in regard to the Eucharist, in regard to sacraments, in regard to faith, and in regard to grace. So all these major theological issues were dealt with in Trent. And I intend to deal with that in a bit more detail actually in a week's time, if you'd like to subscribe. So thank you very much for watching today, and this is Enda Benson saying goodbye for now.